Welcome to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk.
Hey everyone, it's Jenny Lisk, and this is episode 129 of the Widowed Parent Podcast. So I had such a great discussion with Melissa Williams-Gurian for this episode. And I'm grateful that Melissa was willing to speak with me because she doesn't do this work professionally. She was sharing with us from her own personal experience of losing her mom when she was just 15. And maybe this is around the ages that some of our kids were when our spouses died. I know my kids were 9 and 11. And I always think that talking with people who lost a parent at a young age is such a privilege as a parent. It puts things on my radar screen that I wouldn't have necessarily thought of. It helps raise my awareness, increase my understanding of what kids go through when they lose a parent, what those experiences may be like. So I hope it helps to increase your awareness and understanding too. Before we jump into my discussion with Melissa, I wanted to let you guys know some news from here. First of all, in case you missed it over on social media, be sure you're following me at LiskJenny. I announced last week, as part of Children's Grief Awareness Month, that I am working on a children's book series, picture books for young kids. It's a 24-book series, and I am very excited to be teaming up with my daughter, who's the illustrator. So these books are for grieving kids. All of the stories center the experiences of kids who have lost a parent and focus on those kids solving everyday kid problems, made more difficult by the fact that one of their parents has died. So, if you haven't seen the short video yet on social media where I introduced the project, go over there and have a look. Again, it's at LiskJenny on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter. Also now on Hive Social. I got on there yesterday. I haven't done anything yet, but I thought I would check it out since a lot of people seem to be moving away from Twitter. I am still on Twitter, but wanted to hop over there too in case that takes off. So anyway, do follow me and check that out. All right, so that's all the news from here, and let's get on with the show. Support for this podcast comes from BetterHelp. You can talk with a licensed professional therapist online, anytime, anywhere. Visit betterhelp.com/widowedparent to learn more and get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/widowedparent. I hope you'll check it out. My guest today is Melissa Williams-Gurian. Melissa is a therapist and an executive coach and the author of a leadership book called How Do You Want to Show Up? But the reason that I've invited her here today is because she is someone who lost her mom when she was young. She was just 15 years old. Melissa is joining us today from Seattle, Washington. Melissa, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much, Jenny. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm really happy to be here too. And I just said that you're in Seattle. I'm in Seattle, or I'm in the suburbs of Seattle and Redmond. So it kind of feels like we should be sitting down together, in some studio somewhere.
It'd be a lot more fun, right?
Yeah. I don't know. Wouldn't it be? Maybe next time we'll have to do that. Anyway, yeah, cool. Well, I'm very glad to be talking to you. And thank you for being willing to come on and share with us, because I know this isn't your primary line of work. Like I said, you do all kinds of wonderful things. And you yourself have this experience of losing your mom at a young age. And I always think that it's such a privilege to talk to people like yourself as a parent, right? I don't know what it's like to lose a parent at a young age. I mean, my parents are still alive now, right? I'm 50 years old. So I don't know what it's like to lose a parent at all, much less as a 15-year-old or a 3-year-old or some other age, 9 and 11 in the case of my kids. And as a parent, I feel like I can learn so much from adults like you who did live through that experience. So that's a very long way of saying thank you again for coming on. And I think this will be great with Children's Grief Awareness Month in November to share this discussion with our listeners. So let's just jump right in here. Can you tell us a little bit about your family in normal times, like before everything changed? What was normal life like?
Yeah, normal life was like, we're a family of 4. I'm the youngest of 2. I had an older brother that was, 4 years older than me. My parents owned a chain of Hallmark stores. I would describe myself as fun, jovial, just really spirit for life. I went to a prep school. And I was super close to both my mother and my father.
Mm. And did you live here in Seattle or somewhere else?
I grew up in Maryland, so I grew up outside between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay. And so then at some point, everything changed. So can you tell us what happened?
Yeah, and I love how you say that. Like, I might even tear up. I love how you say, like, all of a sudden everything changed, because that's what it feels like, is that there's a sense of youth and joy and inspiration and love and zest for life. And then I would say there's like 3 moments of time where where your life changes forever. And just having my mom diagnosed with so she had breast cancer, and that alone is like your life changed forever.
And how old were you when she was diagnosed?
So I was in 8th grade. I was either 13 or 14, something. Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So anyway, so I loved how you say how your life changes. And I think of that as kind of like, that belief in Santa Claus, right? Like that. And for me, it was Hanukkah Man. And for other people, it might be something else, where, right, you have this beautiful, joyful way of thinking about the world until you find out that they don't exist anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. So you were in 8th grade and your mom was diagnosed, and then was she ill for a while, or like how long did she live from that point?
So she lived for a little over a year and a half.
Okay.
So she went through chemo,
Mm-hmm.
and then stopped chemo, and then the cancer came back,
and
then was terminal.
Mm-hmm. And you were 15 when she died. I'm sorry. That's terrible.
Yeah. Yeah.
And your brother then was maybe 19, it sounds like. Was he out of the house?
Yeah. So during her illness, right, I remember us going to school. So he was out of the house. He was a freshman in college. So it was my mother and I and my father, right, during her treatment. And then it was just my father and I in the house.
So what was that early period like? Whether that's weeks, months, years, what was kind of the early period like? What was the hardest or the strangest?
When she died, or
after she died, yeah.
It was initially, what's lovely is initially we're Jewish, and we held Shiva, and the Jewish community just like comes to your home.
Uh-huh.
And that was beautiful. Uh-huh. And then that time ends, right? And so initially, so we had that, and then my father stepped in a lot, right? He was trying to, my mother had done all the cooking, and he stepped in a lot. But very soon after that, as a widower, he was going through his own stuff, right? And he had his own needs and his own grief, and set out on that for himself. So for me, the word that comes is alone. I was alone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I'm trying to do the math here, and I'm thinking this must have been in the 1980s at some point. And from what I've heard, there wasn't a lot of grief support for kids at that point. Is that something that you were ever connected to, or did you have any resources like that you were participating in?
Yeah, but there were 2 things that really helped in that. One was that hospice had a parent volunteer that happened to be a parent in my school. And she quickly would come meet with me on a weekly basis and bring lunch and sit with me. And
what was or at home?
At school. So she'd come during my lunch hour at school. Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful. I think that's very unusual for that time period.
Yeah, it was. I'd say it's the difference that made a difference for 2 reasons. One, to have an adult, and because she had lost her mom too. So there's 2 pieces. You have an adult that's listening, which is lovely, and with you. And then she was a picture of, I'll be okay. Because look at her. She's now a mom. She had kids. She had a career. So it was helpful to have that picture.
Ah, interesting. Well, I'm glad that you had that kind of support. That's wonderful. So aside from that, I know some kids talk about, school can be awkward, maybe, whether the teachers or the other kids are understanding or not understanding or awkward, or kind of how did some of that unfold for you?
Yeah. Yeah, it's awkward. Teachers, people show up for the funeral, they show up for Shiva, and then there's not a touch there, at least at that time in my community, there was not a touch base of
Mm.
how are you? Can we connect? Yeah. And so of course I was trying to escape, so I would try to escape in my mind, and just be with friends as much as I could. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I wonder about the how you guys, or whether you guys celebrated or acknowledged some of those milestones, like, whether it was your mother's birthday or a death anniversary or Mother's Day or other holidays. Like, is that any thoughts around how that went, or how you guys did those things?
Yeah, I would say I wish there was more of that, I would say, for me. What we did well was, every anniversary of her death, again, in the Jewish tradition, we light a candle and we say a prayer, the mourner's prayer, and we let the candle last for 24 hours. And it's such a beautiful tribute, spirit, connection moment in time.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly there were moments of rituals at like my wedding or the birth or so forth. But to have more rituals would have been lovely.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned your wedding. I'm curious, how did you involve your mom's memory in that?
Yeah. So one was we had a poem that was told or said. We had an empty chair for her, and we talked about her so she could be. So I had the sense of she was with us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How many years was that after your mom had died, approximately?
12 years.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Maybe a little less. Yeah. About 10 years. Yeah.
Right. A good chunk of time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I know one of the things sometimes people wonder, whether it's new widowed parents or sometimes the kids themselves, like a girl might say, who's going to walk me down the aisle if their father has died? Or, a parent might have the same thought, or just, feeling like there's going to be a missing person at some of the graduations, weddings, other milestones, birth of children. And actually, let me ask about that, because I know when we were talking previously, you mentioned you have children. And I'm curious your mother obviously died well before your children were born. They never had a chance to know her in person. I wonder how that maybe had any impact on your experience or on your parenting or anything like along those lines.
Yeah. Because all those questions are so hard. Like how did it impact?
Well, I wonder if you're the type, it's hard to predict, right? But do you think you're the same type of parent you would have been if your mother hadn't died?
Yeah, right. We'll never know on one hand. On another hand, I'm pretty sure. Here's what I can say. I was really alone when my mom died, and there was a real emptiness. And I craved, on all I wanted more than anything was to have a house where a parent was home, and to have stability, and to have presence, and to have interest in me. I just wanted that holding of self, because I believe in that holding of self, that I would have felt grounded, then I would have felt like I could access my potential. And so I have been, I would say, very committed to ensure that I provide that, like that they feel that they know that. Yeah, I would say that would be the biggest gift.
Right.
from
Right.
that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for articulating that, because I think that's a really profound point. And I think sometimes people think, oh, like you were 15 already, so you had your mom for a lot of years and maybe you're practically grown up. And I think it's important to realize that no, there are profound losses at any age, including, as a teenager.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a big developmental that's still happening in the brain,
Mm.
and it also like who you want to become. Like I believe there's a spirit, right, that it has always existed around our potential and our strengths. But yeah, I think those years, at least for me and my experience, is that they were really critical in helping me fly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So what you're saying right now is reminding me, I wonder if it ties to some of the work you've been doing now later professionally, including your book. And I think I forget the words you just said, something about figuring out who you want to become. And I'm wondering if some of these experiences maybe influenced the line of work you chose to go into.
Yeah, well, again, we'll never know.
True, right? You might have been a I don't know, a teacher or a truck driver if you hadn't.
Yeah, I mean, we'll never fully know. I definitely was inspired by, and that's another story around the Hallmark stores and the high performing and lower performing stores. But what I will say is that I do believe that your family of origin shapes who we are. I mean, that's the first group we're ever a part of.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how we learn to be in groups. It's how we learn to communicate. That's how we learn to do conflict. That's how we learn to, that's where our triggers lie, right? And quite frankly, it's where we learn to either talk or not talk about our feelings. So all of that definitely has influenced how and my own belief around the work that I do, that makes a difference to know what those are, so we can be more self-aware, so we can show up more effectively. But yeah, we'll never know.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, well, thank you. One of the things I was wondering about, sometimes people feel like they may hit a turning point at some point where they start to feel like, okay, I can see that things are going to be okay. Either I can say they're okay now, or I can see that I'm on the way to, and whatever okay means, right? And I'm using air quotes that listeners can't see, but I wonder if you felt like there was any sort of a turning point in your journey.
I would say, and I did feel a turning point. What the gift of loss for me was that it was my own sense of like, I need to make this happen. Like, meaning like, it's okay. I learned to be alone. I learned to have a survival instinct around protection of self. I learned how to have drive. I learned how to be independent. I learned how to know myself in a way that I relied on myself to do. So that is the gift. That was one of my gifts, I would say, around that. But I never had a sense of like, I'm going to be okay now. I was just like, okay, now I need to make it happen.
The other thing I was curious about is whether, how old was your mom when she died?
She was 45.
45. Okay. So quite often I hear that people, when they approach that age that their parent was when they died, especially if it's a same-sex parent as you, that they, are afraid something bad is going to happen to them, or they're surprised they live past that age, or there's something that comes up around that date of hitting the date, the age that your mom was, or living past the age that your mom was. And I wonder if you could talk at all about that.
Yeah, no question. I was convinced I was going to die young and die early. I was convinced I was going to get breast cancer, knock on wood. And yeah, there's that fear of that potential. And so definitely when I hit the age of my mom and I outlived her, it was like a big, like, holy cow. And there's this moment of like, wow, she was young. like
Yeah.
to be that age and feel it.
Yeah. Because when you were 15, she probably seemed ancient, or at least,
Mhm.
like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say so. Yeah, that's the hard part. That's the fear is been, yes, it's the negative, I would say, or it's been the hardest part.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm curious whether you've come up with any interesting ways to introduce your children to your mom's memory.
Yeah. I mean, I think one is my firstborn's named after my mother.
Oh,
And, my mom is part of all our, my traditional rituals of life, if that makes sense. And I bring her into our, every annual of her death. We talk about it.
mm-hmm.
And I tell stories of much as I can. Of course, my memory is
Yeah, I hear you.
fading. But I try to bring her in. Like my daughter actually looks nothing like me, which is really a beautiful thing. And I see my mother in her.
Oh, interesting.
Yes. So she's fair skinned, she's blue eyed, she's got big boobs, like she's got all the stuff I don't have.
Uh-huh.
Right. So it's just so fun to see the genetics come through.
Yeah.
And that's that's also a way that I keep her alive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Cool. I'm curious whether there's any kind of surprise kind of gotchas maybe that you think widowed parents should be aware of. Like, I think that everybody probably expects, okay, graduation's coming up, wedding's coming up, that might be hard. For the kid, for the other family members. But are there any kind of things that we should, and other things maybe we're not thinking of that we should be aware of? Times when grief popped up when it wouldn't be expected, or, based on your experience, things that maybe you wish the adults around you had known that this or that was hard when something they weren't expecting.
Yeah, I think the biggest surprise for me is how much today I can, how I can think about her and cry in a second. As if it were yesterday.
Yeah, all these decades, I guess.
All
later.
these decades.
Mm-hmm.
So in the early years, it's a lot, parents are aware of like the early milestones. But as life goes on, right, there's this longing for my mother. And sometimes that can be lost in it. I would say that would be lovely, is keeping that alive from those that know me.
Right. Well, that makes me wonder if sometimes people mention that they get the sense from other people, like, it's been X amount of time, aren't you over it yet? Or it's been, it's been this many years, they're surprised, that you're still grieving or whatever. And I'm wondering if you've encountered any of that.
I haven't encountered it, but I often would have that critical voice inside myself.
Oh, yeah. Right. Like beating yourself up a little bit. Like, how is this still 10, 20, 30 years later? Yeah.
Yeah. Here I am. Right.
Uh-huh.
It still like hits me as if it was yesterday. So there's a bit of like, it's my own inner critic.
Right. Gotcha.
Around that.
Yeah. I wonder if you've heard about or read the book by Hope Edelman called The After Grief.
I haven't.
Oh, I think you might really find that interesting. So she wrote the book Motherless Daughters.
Okay, yes, I read that.
Yeah, which was by now 20 or more years ago. It's a real classic in this genre and grief writing, and huge bestseller. And her most recent book is called The After Grief. And she looks exactly at what you're talking about, this long arc of loss through the lifetime. And the idea that grief isn't something that, like, someone dies and then you grieve for X amount of time and then you're over it and then you're, everything's good. And it's like a past thing, right? The death is in the past, yes. And maybe some of the acute grief is in the past, or maybe not, but the fact that grief still does impact people throughout the lifetime, and maybe in different ways. And she examines that. I thought it was fascinating. And one of the most interesting things is that she found some of the people she originally interviewed for Motherless Daughters, her first book, and went back and re-interviewed them decades later and asked them about their experiences. And then after she interviewed them, she showed them their transcripts from their 20 years ago interviews. And it was fascinating. So I think you might enjoy that.
Yeah, I think I would. That sounds fascinating.
Yeah, I'll put a link in the show notes for listeners too, because I think that it's a really good book. I learned a lot from it. I find it fascinating. Anyway, let's see. Where shall we go next here? Well, let me ask a couple of reflection type questions. I'm curious if you could say one thing to your 15-year-old self or 20-year-old self, what would you go back and tell yourself?
I think that self before diagnosis for me, there's an essence of a child of me that was who I was. So if I were to look at, I would say to myself, go find a photo, go think of a memory of yourself where you felt like fully you. You were alive, you were joyful, you were happy. And write those down. Describe that. And hold that in front of you, because that's who you are. That's your essence. That's you at your best. And hold on to that, because what this experience, this loss, this life, knowing at what it is that when you go through life, right? Well, we all go through changes or what have you, but to hold on to that and look for ways to create context where that can feel that you can access that self. Does that make sense?
Yeah, interesting. It almost sounds like maybe you're saying after your mom died, then something shifted and maybe you lost some sense of who you were.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think life in general, like, we'll always have things come our ways in life. And I think that's just the work of life. It's always getting, at least for myself, always evolving. But I think holding that part of for me, holding that part of myself and reminding myself that piece through the grief, through the hard times, through the aloneness, is useful. Could have been useful. Yeah,
cool. I'm curious if you can share with us maybe the best advice or the worst advice maybe you think you ever got around, grief and loss from anybody along the way.
I think that I don't think I necessarily heard the best advice, but what I can tell you is my best advice.
Okay.
Which is, from my experience, is show up for those that have lost someone. Show up for those that are in mourning, and talk, and don't be afraid to ask, how are you feeling? How are you doing? It's okay to talk about the person that died.
I'm wondering, you mentioned that you had a adult in your school show up for you, the hospice person who was, a parent in your school community. I'm wondering if there were any other people, over the years who maybe, I don't know, stepped in as mentors or supporters, or maybe if your dad built other adults into your life, or kind of anything around that sort of experience.
Yeah, and I think that's also a great advice. Our extended family didn't come forward. I think having a mentor or someone you can really connect to is so incredibly useful. Certainly if you have family members, that's super lovely, but even having any kind of mentor in your life is helpful. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's an important point, and sometimes it's helpful to think about, are there specific people or specific roles, that maybe would help support that child or that teenager, and as a parent, right, and who maybe in your life could be willing to step forward. And you might have to ask them, hey, I'm looking for people to support in this way or that way. Can you help fill that role? Because people don't know, they want to be helpful, but they don't necessarily know what to do, or don't want to step on people's toes or whatever.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm curious, is there something that you feel like the surviving your dad or the other adults in your life did well? What that maybe were helpful to you in this experience?
I guess doing well is my dad's ran in, right, and filled a role it was awkward for him to fill, and was there for me and showing up for me during that time. And I think he has always been, because he knows my mom the best, always been. And this is the other thing that's just beautiful, always, not only through my life, has connected me about my mom and talking to me about Jan and bringing her in the room or bringing her in the conversation. But it's so lovely, not just from my father or from any adults, to share stories about my mother. So I know I reached out to my mom's college roommate, and I would reach out to her friends, and I just love hearing their experience, how they describe her, tell me stories about her.
Yeah. Nice. I love that. Well, I'm glad you were able to make those connections and hear from them. I think that's really, really neat. So gosh, I think we could keep talking about this. But one thing I'm curious about, if you could talk to your mom today, what would you want to tell her, or what would you wish that she knew about you?
Yeah. It's so fascinating about this is that I would love for her, my mom would describe me, I think, as a social butterfly and caring and just like out there wanting to be with people. But what I learned about myself after she died is what an intellect I am and how much culture I love. And she loved culture and art. And so I'd love for her to know that part of myself. And of course, I wish we could share that.
Yeah. That sounds lovely.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything that we haven't covered yet that you think I should have asked you?
I don't think so. Yeah, I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's wrap up. I always like to ask guests if you could say one thing to adults who have a grieving child in their life, what would you say to them?
I would say go be with them. Yeah. Surround yourself, create community with them. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. I think that's a great place to end. So my guest today is Melissa Williams-Gurian, who lost her mom when she was just 15 years old. So Melissa, where can listeners find you if they'd like to reach out or connect or learn about any of your work?
Oh, yeah. My book's called How Do You Want to Show Up? And if you just go howdoyouwanttoshowup.com, you can find me there.
Yeah, terrific. Okay, well, I'll put that link in the show notes. And Melissa, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you for all the work you're doing.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Melissa Williams-Gurian as much as I did. You can find show notes and all the links at widowedparentpodcast.com. Look for episode 129. And if you're finding the Widowed Parent Podcast helpful, please consider supporting the show. It's easy. Just go to buymeacoffee.com/widowedparent. That's buymeacoffee.com/widowedparent. As always, thank you for listening. And until next week, remember, you've got this.
Thank you for listening to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk. Connect with us on social media and at widowedparentpodcast.com.